We greet people? Will we go to movies, restaurants, parties? Will social life be changed forever? Arianna Huffington has given lots of thought to all this. She is the founder of the Huffington Post and now runs Thrive Global, a company dedicated to helping people improve their physical and mental well-being. Welcome, Arianna.
Thank you, Farid.
Arianna, when you look at this COVID crisis, you say, and you've written, that this is part of something much bigger that has been happening before, in the sense that we don't want to go back to a normal, because that normal itself was not very good. Explain what you mean.
So, Farid, we entered this pandemic with four major and growing challenges. The first was the increase in chronic diseases like obesity, diabetes, heart disease. The second was the mental health crisis. Depression, even before the pandemic, was the number one cause of disability globally. The third was something that we talked about endlessly at conferences, but didn't do much about, the growing inequalities. And the fourth, of course, was climate change. Now, all these challenges have their own curves. And while we're talking about flattening the coronavirus curve, we also need to be actively working to flatten all the other curves that I mentioned, because we are incredibly more vulnerable to the coronavirus or any other virus that comes after because of these challenges. We see, for example, the latest study of New York Times admissions in hospital of New York City admission in hospitals in the New York Times that shows that 94% of those admitted had chronic diseases, whether it was diabetes, obesity, or hypertension.
So you bring up a very important point, but what worries me is that COVID actually exacerbates some of these challenges, right? I mean, if you talk about what COVID does to depression, for example, and that sense of loneliness and despair.
Yes, so of course we see now that 2/3 of people who've been surveyed are talking about feeling more depressed, more anxious, definitely more stressed because of all the uncertainty in front of us.
And what about in that reset? Do you think we come to recognize that maybe we've been traveling too much? Maybe we've been, that it's easier, there's a way to do all these things while just being a little bit more still?
Absolutely. I've been talking to friends who have never spent 45 consecutive days with their children, who have not sometimes seen their children for weeks. And suddenly they recognize they can really do the work in a very different way. So what makes me optimistic that we'll come out of this crucible? It's definitely a crucible, a time of extraordinary pain and losses. But I believe we can come out of it much stronger and more resilient than we entered this pandemic.
What do you say to those people who are in pain, though, and lost their jobs, lost a dream? The level of depression here caused by just failure. I mean, you have 35 million people in the United States alone unemployed, God knows how many hundreds of millions outside. How do they grapple with that?
So, of course, the losses have been enormous. But if we don't connect to that place of resilience in us, it will be much harder for people to get through these losses. I mean, we've seen that historically. We've seen people in the most extremely horrendous circumstances being able to survive because they tapped into that place. How we respond to this crisis, whether it's the crisis of the loss of loved ones or loss of jobs, will depend a lot on how connected we are to everything that gives us strength. And it's hard. It's incredibly hard to get to it. But if we know that that place exists and we can find it, and if we can also encourage everyone else to tap into their generosity, whether it's companies that are making decisions to give extra bonuses like Walmart did, or promised not to lay off employees as Salesforce and ServiceNow did. These are very important decisions that companies are making that will define whether they really practice stakeholder capitalism or just preach stakeholder capitalism.
So you have both your daughters with you. You've been with them for 45 days. What is the secret to making this all an incredibly positive experience?
So dinner together every night, definitely. Having a cutoff point when we stop consuming coronavirus news so that we can actually sleep and recharge. And as you know, Farid, more and more people are reporting that they're having a harder time sleeping, which makes us less resilient. And then everybody having a task. Somebody's cooking, somebody else is doing the laundry. And it's just something, of course, that we never expected will be happening with two millennial daughters.
Arianna Huffington, always a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Farid.
I want to conclude this special by giving you my take, drawing on my Washington Post column this week. Despite the fact that, in America at least, the curve has not really flattened, we're all thinking about when and how things will get back to normal. But we should use this crisis as a way to rethink what normal means. The more closely you look, the more it appears that we human beings have been living in a way that makes future pandemics likely, even inevitable. Peter Daszak is a disease ecologist, a renowned virus hunter. He and his team venture into bat caves in full protective gear to get the animal's saliva or blood to determine the origins of a virus. In a conversation with me, he was clear. We're doing things every day that make pandemics more likely. We need to understand this. It is not just nature, it is what we are doing to nature. Remember, most viruses come from animals. The CDC estimates that 3/4 of new human diseases originate in animals. The coronavirus might simply have come from one of those wildlife markets in China where live animals are slaughtered and sold, a practice that should be banned around the world. But it's also true that as human civilization expands, building roads, clearing farmland, constructing factories, excavating mines, we are also destroying the natural habitat of wild animals, bringing them closer and closer to us. Some scientists believe this is making the transmission of diseases from animals to humans far more likely. The virus that causes COVID-19 appears to have originated in bats, which are particularly good incubators for viruses. Scientists are still studying what happened, but in other cases, we've seen how human encroachment can lead bats to look for food around farms, where they then infect livestock and through them infect humans. There are other paths for pathogens. The most likely one comes directly from our insatiable appetite for meat. As people around the world get richer, they tend to eat more meat. Some 80 billion land animals are slaughtered for meat each year. 80 billion around the world. Most livestock is factory farmed, an estimated 99% in America, about 74% around the world, according to one animal rights group. And that entails crowding thousands of animals inches from each other in gruesome conditions that are almost designed to incubate viruses and then encourage them to spread, getting more virulent with each hop. Vox's Sigal Samuel quotes the biologist Rob Wallace. Factory farms are the best way to select for the most dangerous pathogens possible. Factory farms are also ground zero for new antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which is another path toward widespread human infections. Factory farmed animals are bombarded with antibiotics, which means the bacteria that survive and flourish are highly potent. While these animals are not always the source of deadly infections, some 2.8 million Americans are sickened by antibiotic-resistant bacteria annually, of whom 35,000 die every year, according to the CDC. And then there is climate change, which intensifies everything, transforming ecosystems, forcing more animals out of their habitats, and bringing tropical conditions to places that were previously temperate. Scientific American reports the warmer, wetter, and more variable conditions brought by climate change are making it easier to transmit diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, Zika virus, West Nile virus, and Lyme disease in many parts of the world. As we change ecosystems and natural habitats, long dormant diseases can emerge to which we have no immunity. In May 2015, 2/3 of the world's population of saigas, a small antelope, died suddenly within a few weeks. A bacterium called Pasteurella multocida, which had long lived in the animal without doing any harm, suddenly turned virulent. Why? The Atlantic's Ed Yong explains that the region was becoming more tropical, and 2015 was a particularly warm, humid year. When the temperature gets really hot, he writes, and the air gets really wet, saiga die. Climate is the trigger, Pasteurella is the bullet. So let's not get back to just normal. Let's change our ways to make normal life less dangerous for the planet, for nature, and for animals, which of course includes us. Thanks to all of you for being part of this GPS special. I will see you next week and every week at 10 a.m. Eastern on Sundays, right here on CNN.